Alrighty, so welcome everybody. So for this session, we focus on the topic of translanguaging in the classroom. And then today's host, it is myself, Jennifer Silva. I graduated from Sonoma State with bachelor's degree in Spanish and early childhood education. And I'm currently in the multiple subject credential program. And we also have Professor Teresa Burrell-Stone. She's the EduCorps faculty lead and English single subject preparation. And then to start off, some questions that I wanted to start off the discussion with are, what do you think about students using different languages in the classroom? So what do you think, Professor Stone, when you think about this question?
I think a lot about how students often rely on languages and language varieties that they're most comfortable in, especially, when they're talking with their classmates or people who are in their groups. And they'll say to their classmate, like, ¿qué es eso? Or, like just asking questions, just saying getting clarification or like saying hello. And I'm thinking about the ways that, sometimes space is made for that and teachers, encourage their students to help one another in whatever language they feel most comfortable in. And sometimes there's a lot of punishment that surrounds that kind of practice, right? There's a lot of no side talk, or, you have even being very explicit about saying you have to speak in English, right? And those kinds of responses can be really, really damaging, right? Like, how can I not express myself, right? Like I'm trying to be involved, right? So, yeah, those are some of the ways that we often see language varieties taking place in the classroom.
Yeah, I definitely agreed with what you just said. And also just thinking back to just some of my experiences with kids and growing up and going to school, I know that a lot of kids were scared to speak up if they didn't know the language. So then sometimes it makes you think they don't know the content. But if you would give them the opportunity to say it in another language, you would be like, oh yeah, he actually understands what's going on. He just can't say it in the language that I'm wanting him to say it in. So I feel as educators, we need to give students that opportunity to use their languages in the classroom and see what students know and not limit them. How might we already practice using different languages in the classroom? When I think about this question, I know that right now there's dual language programs who are incorporating Spanish and English, or there's other bilingual programs who are trying to use the languages for students. But those are the only ones that I can think of off my top of my head. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely dual immersion programs, right? English Mandarin, English Spanish, that have become really popular, and sometimes it's even hard for those who are speaking the non-dominant language to get into these classes, because they become popular with a lot of white middle class families who see and experience languages other than English as a cultural capital, right? Whereas when racialized speakers speak their home languages, right, a lot of times it's seen as a bad thing, something to be eradicated. And so then we end up seeing, what have been called ESL, English as a second language classrooms, that are really just built to get children and young people speaking English as soon as possible, and really don't think about, this wide variety of languages, language practices that they already have. So Um, I think that's really important. And then also, like, we think about the varieties of English that people use. We think about, like, April Baker Bell just gave a great talk about Black English varieties, right? And how we can center those and think about how um, the ways that certain speakers, right? Black speakers, Latino speakers, um, native indigenous language speakers have been punished over and over for speaking what is a home language to them. And, there's been a lot of violence in that.
Yeah, I definitely agree
Mm.
with what you just stated. Um, and then just to go over just how there has been laws that outlaw bilingual education programs. So, for example, even here in the state of California, 1998, Proposition 227 required California public schools to teach LEP students in special classes that are taught nearly in all English. So this provision had the effect of eliminating bilingual classes in most cases. And then recently, 5 years ago, Proposition 58 repealed against this restriction. So we saw kind of like a push forward to bring back those bilingual education programs into our classrooms. And then even in Arizona in the year 2000, they had a proposition also that limited the type of instruction available to English language learners. So again, there's this pushback to take these bilingual education programs out of the schools and just enforce an English only instruction. And Massachusetts, 2002, there was another law that had like limited exceptions, but mostly focused on all public school children must be taught English by being taught all subjects in English and being placed in English language classrooms. So there we get that push again to only have that English only instruction. Um, and that makes us question like what is trying to stop it. That was one of the questions that when I see all of this happening, it's like, why are you trying to stop bilingual education programs? Like, do you, you're not seeing how it is affecting many of the children that are in their classrooms.
Mhm.
um, and then translanguaging versus code switching, just because like before I started knowing about this whole topic of translanguaging, I was like, oh, it's kind of like code switching, but it's not. So code switching is when you go from one language to another, so you're switching back between two languages or more. And then translanguaging is more like a communicative resource a student has to make meaning and to learn. So translanguaging does not view the language systems of a bilingual speaker as distinct, but it's part of a whole single interconnected system. Um, so I thought that was a really good way of explaining like the difference between the two.
Mhm.
And then translanguaging and how it's utilized. So it's utilized to mediate understandings. So you use languages because you want to ensure that another person understands what you're trying to say. You're using translations and different interpretations um, to mediate with others and yourself, and then to co-construct meaning. So you're drawing on your home language or your first language to understand what others are telling you or what's going on. And then it's also used to include, so being responsive to others person's language. So for example, if you're talking to someone but you see that they're not really understanding what you're saying, you're trying to you kind of like catch that, and then you're like, okay, how can I help that person understand what I'm saying? And then it's also to exclude, so when you want to leave out others from the interaction. And then it's also to show knowledge, so individuals trying out words that they already know, so you want to show I got this, I know what I'm talking about, I know what I'm doing. um, and then translanguaging, I know that at the beginning I said, oh, okay, I can think that dual programs are really good. They're incorporating the language, they're using them, but it's also a limitation. So in the case of transitional bilingual classrooms, they focus on transitioning children who are requiring English to English only instruction. So it's just like a bridge. So here we give you Spanish, but it's just a bridge so that you learn English, and then they're not really connecting both languages. You're just using one language to get to another. So what's going to happen with the other language? You're going to leave it behind. And then with dual language classrooms, they're separating English and Spanish. So for example, there's the model of 90-10 for like the younger grades, where the main instruction is Spanish, and then you get 10% English, but that's only for a designated time, and it's only for a certain amount of kids who are English language learners, but it's not with the whole classroom. And then there's also 50-50 models where as the kids get older, you're teaching some subjects in one language, other subjects in another language, but you're not really blending both languages or merging them together. You're still keeping them separate. Um, so that leads to my discussion. So some of the questions that I thought are, what might these ideas mean for you as aspiring teachers?
Yeah, this is such an important question, Jennifer. I'm really glad you brought it up. Um, just a few weeks ago, in my class for future English teachers, about the title is teaching, reading, and responding to literature. We talked about translanguaging, right? We talked about what it means to plan content area instruction, right? English language arts is a content area, science is a content area, right? It's not about the language itself, although English gets a little closer to that. But I think what I'm saying here is that it doesn't have to, right? Our language arts can take into account like our entire person. Our language arts don't just have to kind of be like, well, here are my language arts in English. Here are my language arts in Spanish. Here are my language arts in French, right? If people are taking this other language, right, which is always viewed as a status language, right? It's connected to these like elite ideas that have to do with French, France being right this colony, this place in Europe that's very much associated with high class things. Like that's just kind of how it ends up permeating the ways that we think about these languages, right? Which languages are offered and why do we choose to take them? So in my class, we were talking about translanguaging, and it really seemed to resonate with a lot of the future English teachers that I work with, many of whom do speak Spanish as a first or home language, and who have experienced, their elementary and secondary schooling in ways that are really negative, right? Or even their early college years, and being told, well, how can you be an English teacher, right? And this, kind of like possessiveness over who can be an expert on, a particular subject, especially when it has to do with language. So when I think about aspiring teachers, right, this is both like their practices, and then there are it's like a way of viewing language that we can bring to our classrooms, where we can bring our whole selves, where our students can bring their whole selves, and they're not punished for giving an answer that is really brilliant in terms of content, right? And also really brilliant linguistically, but because of the ways that different languages and language varieties are valued, then it's discounted, right? Like I remember when I was, like in junior high and high school, students who spoke what was viewed as like non-standard varieties of English would constantly be corrected, right? And so how do you want to like contribute and show your learning in a classroom where you're always told that as soon as you open your mouth you're wrong, right? So this is like a real intervention on the ways that we can show up in the classroom, both ourselves as educators and also our students.
Yeah, I totally agree what you said. I feel like using translanguaging, like thinking about it, like just for my point of view, I feel like it could really be an empowerment for the children and even for their own social emotional development. Like if you think about if you were to include their like experiences or language in the classroom and going back to what you said like oh okay that is wrong, that is not how you say it. Like can you imagine how much you would boost a student's like self-confidence, determination to do things like I really feel like you would have more student engagement and like productivity in your classroom. You're not limiting them or pushing them or telling them no you can't do that, but rather you're giving them that confidence to like do good in school, to like meet um the standards, exceed. Like I really feel like just for me it's like if I can do that for my students, why wouldn't I? Why would I want to hurt them rather than help them?
Yeah.
So that was something that I was thinking, and it connects back to this whole idea of like what does translanguaging have to do with social justice? And just the way that I see it is you just can't. I don't see it as being fair to the students. When I was reading back and looking through all of these things, something that Ofelia Garcia, one of the um, she's a professor in bilingual education, and one of the things that she said was this example of like having two kids and they're drummers, right? And you tell one kid, okay, you're gonna drum using two hands, and then you tell the other kid you're gonna drum using one hand, but and you're expecting to hear the same sound, but how can you if you're limiting the other one from using its other hand? So
Mhm.
that was like, okay, yeah, like I can totally see this. I know what it's trying to say. You're not being fair. You're expecting the same result, but you're limiting the other child. Or you're testing the child only in one language, assessing them in one language. But obviously, compared to the student who's just monolingual, he's not going to do better because you're cutting like half of his knowledge and you're not taking into consideration his other languages and what they know.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really powerful example. Um, yeah, it's a really great image, right? And it connects um, directly to the ways that yeah, that Dr. Ofelia Garcia has talked about, you know, this idea that, you know, we have like this single linguistic repertoire, right? Like we have all of our resources right here. Um, you know, and as this you mentioned, right? It's like this like we can draw on them all, right, to make the beat, right, to get our ideas out, right, to get them out in their fullness, or we can be, you know, stuck over here, only using half or maybe a third, right, like of the linguistic resources that we have, right. And so when we are able to draw upon all of the linguistic resources that we carry with us, um, you know, we bring a lot more fullness to it. We can bring a whole lot more creativity, right? There's so much creativity in the ways that languages come together, right? In particular places, in particular times, in particular speakers, right? And a lot of times, those languages are denigrated, right? When we think about like the evolution of Black English, right? Those varieties developed from the language varieties that people who were enslaved brought with them from Africa, right? So there's syntactical, there are like all these different things that carried over into this new version of English, right? And when we think about like Galo, and we think about this like creation of like a Chicano's English, right? There are these words that have particular meanings attached to the time in which they came about, and connect to the very real lived experiences of the people who created this new way of expressing how they saw and experienced the world, right? And so these are really beautiful and creative acts, right, that come from these experiences. And so the ways that these languages have been outlawed in many ways, like literally, um, really speaks to wanting to kind of cut off those connections, right? Really wanting to cut off the connections to expressions of our experiences. Um, and so, you know, thinking about translanguaging and social justice, right? It's clearly, right, this social justice issue. Being able to bring our full linguistic repertoire, being able to speak to our experiences in language that specifically came about in order to describe it, right? These linguistic resources that didn't exist before, that were created in community in response to specific lived conditions. And right, and that's creativity that's ongoing. New groups of speakers, new generations of speakers, new ways that different languages come together. Right, there's so much like beautiful creativity, that should be celebrated. And I think that's another way to think about this as a social justice issue, right? When people in the right bodies and with the right class, right, when you're white and middle class, speak languages other than English, right? It's like celebrated. And it's like, oh, great, that's wonderful. And so is going to go abroad and learn this language. And it's a plus. But then when people who are racialized, right? People who are looked down upon or exploited because of their class, right? Because of the migration status, because they're Black, because they're brown, because they're Native, right? When those language varieties, right? When we speak multiple languages, those are not applauded, right? Or they only start to be applauded when we start to speak, when we start to tear ourselves apart, right?
Yeah.
When we only speak like, okay, this is, like the Academia Real, is that the like
Mm.
Spanish, like from Spain dictionary, right? When we're speaking that kind of Spanish, and when we're speaking this very specific, but also very imagined variety of English. Sometimes white middle class speakers, if we actually look at their speech, and linguists have done this, right? They look at the speech and it's not as perfect and proper as people imagine. And then when we look at the speech um, of speakers who are racialized, their language can totally match all of these like supposed like markers of good English, but people don't hear it that way. Um, and so that's part of the problem also, right? And we have scholars also who've talked about that. Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores have written about this idea of undoing appropriateness. And that as long as we say, well, as long as you speak appropriately, you need to learn to speak appropriately, then you'll be accepted. And so they tear apart this idea by examining what they have called racio linguistic ideologies. And these ideologies or views of language help us understand that it's really not about the speech that we produce, right? But it's about these ways that the white listening subject, as they've called it, adapting from other people's work, the white listening subject, and this doesn't have to be a person in a white body. Sometimes these are people and people of color too, right? Who hear, right, through these racializing ears, right, who are going to hear us as incorrect as long as they're invested in our dehumanization, right, and as long as they're invested in our exploitation. And so translanguaging is absolutely a social justice issue, right? It's like, how do we welcome our students into the classroom, right? And how do we deal with these messages of appropriateness that a lot of us were brought up in? Um, I think about my mother, whose first language was Spanish. And when she started school in California in the 1950s, she was really punished, and anyone who was speaking Spanish was really punished for it. And she, in a sense, kind of like unlearned it and disconnected from it. And it was a real loss. And that happened with all her siblings, the 5 siblings. There's this real disconnection. And that disconnects us from one another, right? That disconnects us from being in community. Um, and she was one of the first Mexican American women to graduate from college. She went to community college. Had a counselor there say, Like, why bother come back when she dropped for a term? Because you're never going to transfer anyway. I mean, that was the constant view of her. She always in school had to really fight, to be put into classes that would prepare her to go to college. There was always the assumption that she couldn't go, right? That wasn't for her. Um, and so then she transferred to Long Beach State and graduated from there in 1971. But there is also, um, this effort and this push, right, to speak English a particular way. Right. We could say in some ways, yeah, like she was able to go to college during a time when most Chicana, Mexican American, Latina women were not, right? There are very few. It was just when those numbers were starting to grow. Um, but at the same time, right, there's a loss of connection, and that's a price that's really difficult to quantify. It can't be quantified, right? We can't even begin to think about what that means. And when I think about that, um, it's really important to think about the histories of cutting people off from their languages, right? The US has a systematic history of doing that. um, so in another one of my classes where we talk about language, for future English teachers, we read a piece by Malathi Iyengar, I believe is her name. And so this scholar looks at the ways that the same time that Native peoples were being cut off from their languages, punished, taken from their homes, put into boarding schools in order to destroy those cultural, familial, tribal connections, in order to destroy languages and practices. Um, European immigrants that were being encouraged to settle the US were offered, yeah, you can have school in your language, right? This was during the Common School era. We will support, you want to keep speaking German? Come and keep speaking German. You want to keep speaking, um, I don't remember the other specific European languages that were popular during that time, but that was part of the, in a sense, attraction. It was part of the, like, please come migrate here, fill up this space, right? Refill the space. We're going to destroy and we're going to replace. And we have these two very different language policies happening. And so there was a lot of schooling at the time that was bilingual, but it was only to attract and to grow the numbers of white settlers. Um, and so that's a really important history also to think about as we think about translanguaging in the classroom, right? A lot of Native communities in the US are doing really amazing work revitalizing, right? Returning and relearning their Indigenous languages. And so it's so important to think about, what does translanguaging look like when we have students that are speaking and learning to reclaim Indigenous languages, right? And how do we also serve the Indigenous students or young people, children, who a lot of whom are refugees currently coming from like Guatemala and other Central American countries, right? Who are being forced to flee there. So there's so many histories, right? There's so many different experiences that we can really connect to the need for translanguaging, right? We can connect to this need um, for honoring and making space and sustaining and revitalizing our languages in classrooms. I know that was a lot, but this is something I'm really passionate about because it shaped my life, right? It really shaped how do I connect to people, right? Like I had to learn Spanish as an adult um, because it wasn't something that I was able to learn as a child, right? Because of these policies and practices.
Yeah, no, definitely. I understand because even myself, like growing up, for me it was always like school was always like English, English, English. And I was in this like Spanish immersion program, but they really didn't speak to me in Spanish. It was just like using Spanish as a bridge to learn the English language, right? So it
Mhm.
was just me out in my own trying to like retain my language. And my parents were like, okay, no, you have to keep your Spanish. Or I was like, what are you going to pass on? What cultures are, or like, what language are you going to pass on to your children, to like future generations? You know, like, what are they going to know? Like, eventually, if you stop speaking the language, there's going to be like nothing there anymore. So it was kind of like me, like, okay, going out of my way. I remember going to when we got to order books from like Scholastic, I was over here buying like the bilingual books because I wanted to read them in English and I wanted to read them in Spanish, you know. I
Mhm.
wanted to keep that Spanish. That's what motivated me to get my bachelor's degree in Spanish, to be a bilingual teacher. It's like I want to retain my language. And sometimes like I look back to the some of the people that I went to school with and they're like, "Oh, I don't really, I mean, it's like I can speak Spanish, but I can't read it because they were just focusing on English." So sometimes I'm thankful that I took the time to like work hard to retain my language, but it's like what could have been if the school tried to, and then all of these other kids that I went to school with would be on the same page as me. And it's kind of sad to like look back and think of, why were you limiting us? Why is just English so important, but all these other languages and other cultures that are part of our society not included?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, and then just some final thoughts from Ophelia Garcia. Something that she said in one of her videos is translanguaging redresses the power differentials and the systems of control that have been installed in the conceptions of languages by colonial expansion and nation building. So I think that's some of your points too, and what we've been talking about.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great quote. It's yeah, and I think you were going to share with us where we could find the video.
Yeah,
Right.
I
No.
have
Yeah.
some links here.
Oh, okay. So there's one titled "What is Translanguaging?"
So they both focus on that topic of what is translanguaging. I have two.
Oh, okay, nice.
So
Was it
one's
Ofelia
here.
Garcia?
Yeah, they're both by Oferta Garcia. This first one is just like a 1 minute. What is translanguaging? How can you use it? And then the second one is more like a 16-minute talk that she goes on to have with other people. She goes more in depth of what is translanguaging. That's where she gave that example of the drummer.
Mm,
And I took that quote from her to sum it all up, but she really dives into that whole topic and talks more about it. So that was really helpful for me too, to like hear it from her and show me like, okay, this is what translanguaging is. This is what why it's important. How can we do it?
mm,
So those are really good videos.
I also want to share this resource. I have it with me. This is a book. We do some theoretical readings as well, but this is a really great book for practitioners to use translanguaging in the classroom. And this isn't, again, just for like bilingual or dual immersion classrooms. This is for any and all content area classrooms, right? This is for science, this is for math, this is for history, this is for English language arts, because really we want to, like, how can we make this shift and think about language arts, right? Yes, we're going to communicate in English, but how can we like really fit the fullness, right, of our Englishes, and how can we fit the fullness of all of our languages and our students' languages into what we do in the classroom?
Definitely.
Hmm. All right. So Jennifer, this is like such a great discussion, and such a great really, really wonderful introduction to translanguaging. And I really appreciate you sharing this, and sharing your own experiences to help us better understand what this looks like in our lives, right? Like, what does this look like for individuals, and what does it look like for communities, right? And we talked about the history, talked about laws, right? And I was thinking back to that law. I think the one in Arizona was titled English for the Children, right? And it's really, right? It's really problematic the way that it's made to seem like we're serving the children, right? It's like really twisting these histories by making it seem like we need to do best for the children and only give them English. When, there are so many really wonderful scholars' work that shows that this is not the case. And in our personal experiences testify to that as well, right? This is not the case. That we really would be best served by having our languages valued, by helping us increase our literacies in multiple languages and multiple English varieties, right? So these are such important discussions. So I thank you so much for really helping us think through these ideas today.
Yeah, of course, you're welcome. And thank you for being here and being part of the discussion and getting these ideas out to different people.
Yeah, yeah, really glad to. There's one thing I would like to share as we are closing up, and that is EduCorps' celebration of teaching that is coming up really soon. So EduCorps is supporting future educators. We're answering questions for people who are like, oh, I don't know about that, but maybe, like now that I heard you talk about translanguaging, maybe I can think about schooling as a different, I could take up a different kind of role than I had imagined in the past as what teachers do. So we're going to have a great kickoff event with people sharing their testimonials about why they were called to be teachers. Future STEM educator session, future multilingual educator session. We're going to hear from some different current credential students like Jennifer. We're going to hear from the new and really important Male Educators of Color organization on campus. We have an ethnic studies in K through 12 classrooms advocating for Black, Indigenous, and POC and multilingual children and youth. This will be a really great session where we can learn about how classroom teachers are finding ways to negotiate ethnic studies into their curriculum and pedagogy or their teaching practices, and also the different programs that are available for ethnic studies at SSU that provide those knowledges and approaches. We have two different growing community and support sessions that are going to be really great. One that's looking at restorative practices, and the other that's thinking about, while I'm at SSU, while I'm an undergraduate student, how can I really build and learn in community about all the different people, all the different needs that my future students may have. We're going to close out with a chance for everyone to talk with current educators in the classroom. And I think that will be a lot of fun. A lot of those kind of questions you'll be able to ask there. So thanks again for joining us, and we wish you a really good rest of your day.